They didn't just execute him, they made him an example. For hours, François Ravaillac screamed as red-hot pincers tore into his flesh, as molten lead filled his wounds, as his limbs were slowly ripped from his body by 4 horses pulling in opposite directions. And when it was finally over, when there was nothing left but scattered pieces of a man who had killed a king, the crowd didn't look away. They cheered. Paris, May 14th, 1610. The streets were alive with celebration. King Henry IV, beloved by many, hated by some, was riding through the narrow corridors of the Rue de la Ferronnerie in an open carriage. The air smelled of horse manure and fresh bread. Merchants shouted their wares. Children ran between the wheels of carts. It was an ordinary day in an extraordinary city. But François Ravaillac had been waiting. A tall, red-haired man with hollow eyes and trembling hands, Ravaillac had convinced himself he was chosen by God. He believed the king was a heretic, a traitor to the Catholic faith, a man whose tolerance of Protestants would damn all of France to hellfire. For weeks he had stalked the royal processions, clutching a knife beneath his cloak, whispering prayers, waiting for the perfect moment. And then the carriage stopped. A hay cart had blocked the street. The king's guards moved ahead to clear the path. For just a moment, Henry IV was alone, unprotected, vulnerable. Ravaillac stepped forward. He didn't hesitate. He didn't speak. He simply drove the blade into the king's chest. Once, twice, 3 times. The king gasped. Blood soaked through his doublet. His head fell back against the cushion. By the time the guards returned, Henry IV, King of France and Navarre, the man who had ended decades of religious war, was dead. Ravaillac didn't run. He stood there, knife still in hand, staring at what he had done. When the guards seized him, he smiled. He had done God's work, he said. He had saved France. But France would not thank him. They dragged him to the dungeons of the conciergerie. For 13 days they tortured him. They wanted names, conspirators, accomplices, proof that this was more than the act of one delusional fanatic. They crushed his legs in the boot, a vice that shattered bone and tendon. They poured water down his throat until his stomach swelled like a balloon, until he vomited blood and bile. They hung him from iron chains and beat him with iron rods. But Ravaillac gave them nothing. He insisted he had acted alone, that no man had commanded him, only God. Whether it was faith or madness or simple stubbornness, he would not confess to a conspiracy that didn't exist. So they decided he would die in a way that would make conspiracy irrelevant. He would die in a way that would terrify anyone who ever thought of harming a king again. May 27th, 1610. The Place de Grève. Tens of thousands gathered in the square, packed shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks for a view. Vendors sold wine and bread. Mothers lifted children onto their shoulders. This wasn't just an execution. It was theater. It was justice. It was a warning written in flesh and blood. Ravaillac was led onto the scaffold in nothing but a shirt. His legs were still broken from the torture. He could barely stand. 2 executioners held him upright as a priest whispered final prayers into his ear. Ravaillac didn't seem to hear. His eyes were distant, glassy, somewhere far beyond the crowd, beyond the scaffold, beyond the world of men. The sentence was read aloud. The crowd fell silent. First, they would burn the hand that had held the knife. A brazier was brought forward, glowing with coals. The executioner forced Ravaillac's right hand into the fire. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, acrid and nauseating. Ravaillac screamed. It was a sound that didn't seem human, a raw animal howl that echoed across the square. The hand turned black, the skin cracking and peeling away like old parchment. But that was only the beginning. Next came the pincers, red-hot iron, heated until they glowed orange. The executioners worked methodically, almost surgically. They tore into his chest, his arms, his thighs, ripping away chunks of flesh, exposing muscle and bone beneath. Into each wound, they poured molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin mixed with sulfur. The wounds hissed and smoked. Ravaillac's screams became hoarse, then silent, then screams again as he found breath somewhere deep in his ruined lungs. The crowd watched. Some cheered, some looked away. Some simply stared, unable to process the horror unfolding before them. And then came the horses. 4 massive draft horses were led to the scaffold, each one tied to one of Ravaillac's limbs. The executioner raised his hand. The crowd held its breath. The horses pulled. At first, nothing happened. Ravaillac's body stretched, his joints cracking, but his limbs remained attached. The executioner cursed. He ordered the horses to pull harder. They strained against their harnesses, hooves scraping against the cobblestones. Still, the body held. For over an hour, the horses pulled. The executioner grew frustrated. He took a knife and began cutting into the joints, severing tendons, weakening the connective tissue. Blood pooled on the wooden scaffold, dripping down into the square below. Finally, with a sound like wet cloth tearing, Ravaillac's right arm came free, then the left leg, then the other arm. The horses dragged the limbs across the square, trailing blood and meat behind them. What remained on the scaffold was no longer recognizable as human. It was a torso, still breathing somehow, still clinging to life with a stubbornness that seemed almost supernatural. The executioner stepped forward and, with a single blow, ended it. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, some vomited, some simply turned and walked away, silent, haunted by what they had witnessed. Ravaillac's remains were burned, his ashes scattered, his name cursed. His family was banished from France, forbidden from ever using the Ravaillac name again. His house was torn down, the ground salted so nothing would ever grow there. They wanted to erase him, to make him forgotten, and for the most part, they succeeded. François Ravaillac died believing he was a martyr. The state wanted him to die as a monster. But what he truly was, perhaps, was something more unsettling. A man so consumed by his own certainty that he destroyed not only a king, but himself and countless others in the process. We remember his victim. We remember Henry IV, the king who brought peace to a broken nation. But we forget the fanatic, the man whose name was deliberately erased from history, whose death was meant to serve as both punishment and warning. Yet here we are, more than 400 years later, still talking about him, still trying to understand what drives a human being to such an act, and still asking ourselves the same question that haunted the crowds who watched him die. How much suffering is enough to balance the scales of justice? And when does punishment become something darker, something that says more about us than the condemned? If this story left you unsettled, if it made you think, I need you to do something for me, hit that like button. It tells me you want more of these forgotten, brutal stories from history's darkest corners. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Ravaillac's execution was justice, or did France become the monster it was trying to punish? I read every single comment, and your perspectives matter. And if you're hungry for more stories like this, more dark history, more brutal truths, more forgotten executions that shape the world we live in, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because history wasn't written in textbooks, it was written in blood, screams, and the terrible things human beings are capable of doing to each other. I'll see you in the next one, if you have the stomach for it.